main focus is basically a warning to the disciples about how their life is going to look like once their service has started. Now, I'm sure if we sit down and study this passage, we can find a lot of attributes and a lot of connections to St. Mary. But tonight, I just want to focus on one or two of these that really stood out to me. In verse 16, Jesus says to the disciples, "Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." So in this context, I want to turn our attention to the Theotokos, not just as the mother of God, but also because through her life, she really does embody the spirit of this passage. Jesus says we must be innocent as doves. So does that mean we need to be naive? Is this really what St. Mary's personality was? If we recall the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel appeared to St. Mary and he announces to her that she's going to be the mother of God. Do you remember St. Mary's reaction? So let's dwell on her situation for a moment. First, she's an unmarried teenager who's suddenly told that she's going to be pregnant by some miracle. The second thing is she lives in a small conservative town, and this means that very quickly the word is going to spread, everybody's going to find out, there's going to be public shame, there might even be death threats. And finally, she's told that Elizabeth is pregnant. In this situation, what do you think her reaction should have been? Honestly, if it was me, I can only think of two ways this could have gone. Either she would have been petrified and completely overwhelmed, thinking about just how massive this problem is and how she's going to deal with it. Alternatively, she could have been proud and thought of herself as the most important person in the world. I'm going to be the mother of God. Instead, she takes a different path. She straight away responds to the angel, "Behold, the maidservant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word." You see, in this moment, she couldn't even allow reason or logic to move her to fear. And on the other end of the spectrum, she refuses to allow pride or self-interest to stain her obedience. So in complete humility, she not only fully trusts in God's plan, but she goes above and beyond. She decides to go and visit Elizabeth, whom she suspects will also need assistance. I heard recently from another talk about St. Mary, about the interesting thing about this visit is that during a pregnancy, the most difficult periods are generally the first and the third trimesters. At this moment, or at this point in time, Mary would have been in her first trimester, and Elizabeth in her second. So she would have been struggling more. Yet this doesn't even cross her mind. She immediately gets up and goes to serve at Elizabeth's feet. So yes, her physical virginity is really important. But what is truly remarkable about St. Mary is her purity, her interior purity. She had a heart that was fully devoted to God. But does this mean that because of her innocence, that makes her exempt from physical pain? When the time came for her to give birth, there was no place to take them in. And so what happens? She quietly, silently gives birth in a barn in the middle of nowhere. Does she complain? Does she open her mouth? Nothing. And later on, when she takes Jesus to be presented in the temple, and Simeon says to her, "Yes, a sword will pierce through your soul also." Does she say anything? Silence. And then Herod massacres all the male children under 2, and she has to flee, and she spends 3.5 years as a refugee in Egypt. And does she say anything? Again, silence. And then she stands at the foot of the cross, watching her innocent son and God die. And even then, she doesn't react. The truth is that sometimes we tend to forget that St. Mary was also a human. Our deep love for her sometimes causes us to venerate her so much, or to the point that we forget that she too had feelings. She too had thoughts. She was plagued by temptations. She felt tired. She was burnt out. She would have had doubts and questions. But the defining factor, or the defining attribute, is not in her experience, but rather in her response to that experience. So in the face of overwhelming responsibility, she responds with obedience. And when she's venerated and glorified, she responds with humility. And in pain and suffering, she responds with silence and prayer. So when she's faced with all these factors, she always remains as innocent as a dove. She could have tried to defend herself. She could try to explain her situation, try to clear her name of shame. Instead, she chooses to entrust herself to God. Behold, the maidservant of the Lord. And in her gentleness, she shows a strength that the world couldn't understand. In her quite humble faith, we find something so much more powerful than any argument she could have made. In being as innocent as a dove, she shows purity and gentleness. So throughout her life, she's consistently a beacon of virtue and hope for everyone who looks to her for guidance. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And when we look at St. Mary's life, we see this lived out perfectly. She's the example of someone who walked among wolves, the dangers, the misunderstandings, the accusations, the cruelty of this fallen world. And yet throughout all of this, she remains pure. She remains wise, gentle, faithful, humble, joyful, and so on. And she shows us that our safety is only in Christ. We can't overcome our trials through our own strength, but by staying close to Christ. And she shows us that gentleness isn't weakness, but it's power under control. You see, a dove isn't weak. It's simply not violent. Gentleness is not refusing, or it's not just refusing to conform to the world, but it's thriving and becoming a beacon in the midst of this darkness. So oftentimes we view victory as overcoming enemies, as winning arguments. But St. Mary shows us that victory in God's kingdom is being faithful to the end, from Bethlehem to the Calvary, without losing trust for a single moment in God. St. Mary teaches us that true strength is not in dominating others, but in remaining faithful to God no matter the cost. She shows us that wisdom and gentleness are not opposites. They work together in a believer. Wisdom guards us from falling into traps, and gentleness guards us from becoming like the wolves around us. So we need both.